this is a conversation which is particularly timely at the moment, and it really does sit at the heart of the debate around the energy transition. That being, how can we ensure that industry remains competitive, resilient, and really future-proofed in a world where our power system is rapidly evolving around us? So we're very fortunate today to be joined by three experts with distinct but very relevant and complementary views when it comes to this topic. And that is Noel Collings, Head of Net Zero and Energy, West Yorkshire Combined Authority, Professor Jeanette Whittaker, Associate Science Director, UKCEH, and Carl Smith, Director of External Affairs and Strategic Policy, Infinium. So the plan for the next hour is really to get into the weeds on this quite broad topic, covering things such as system design, technology innovation, but also through to investment, regulation, and confidence as well. Our aim is to cover the barriers, the opportunities, but also some of the trade-offs that the sector faces. And of course, we'll try and leave 15 minutes, 10 minutes or so at the end to cover any questions that you may have as well. So please do keep those questions in mind as they come up. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our experts to give a brief introduction about themselves, the perspectives that they'll be bringing to this conversation. And perhaps, Noel, I can come to you first.
Thank you very much. Oh, there we go. Won't get too close. Afternoon, everybody, sorry. So Noel Collings, I am the Head of Net Zero and Energy Policy at the West Yorkshire Combined Authority. So hopefully some of you saw my mare talking this morning and were suitably enthused by what she had to say. So I look after our strategic work around net zero and energy. So very much thinking around what is our policy, what is our strategy around energy, thinking about what's our pipeline of projects, what is our kind of approach to strategic energy planning within the context of our net zero target that we have in West Yorkshire, which is net zero by 2038. So kind of the work that I'm involved in, of which industry kind of forms a very, very key part of that, is all kind of looking at how do we get towards those ambitions and those targets.
Thank you. And Jeanette?
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Jeanette Whittaker. I'm Associate Science Director at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. UKCEH is a research institute that provides solutions to the complex, urgent environmental challenges that we're facing today. We have over 600 scientists spread across the UK working on issues around climate change, air quality, biodiversity loss, those kind of environmental issues. But today we're here to talk about this renewable energy future that we're all dreaming about. And I'm here to talk about that because it's really important that as we take this transition, which is really, really critical transition, to mitigate climate change, to generate a sustainable future, that we don't create unintended consequences. So we protect biodiversity. We make sure that we look after the resources that we're going to need for this transition. We need to look after our land, air and water. And so in CEH, we provide evidence to underpin the kind of decision-making that you're making in governments, in business, in local authorities and regional bodies. And so it's just really interesting to understand the industrial perspective on this, to see how we can take this forward. For me, I'm a soil scientist. My background, I've been in CEH for 30 years, and my work is really around land use. How do we use our land to provide all of the things that we need? So food, fibre, energy, and do that in a sustainable way. And so it's really interesting to bring together these different strands of kind of progress, transition, renewable energy futures, but really think about those in terms of the environmental context that we're all living in, so that in the future people and nature can thrive and progress. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jeanette, and over to you, Carl, as well.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Carl Smith. I'm Director of External Affairs at Infinium. So Infinium, our primary role is to take society's unrecyclable waste, which would otherwise go to climate-damaging landfill, and turn it into useful homegrown energy. We have 6 sites around the UK. We're very much a northern business, so we've got 3 sites in West Yorkshire, including a new £500 million facility we opened down the road in Starriton last year. At the moment, we use that unrecyclable waste to power homes and businesses, But our ambition going forward is to use carbon capture and storage to become a carbon negative business and provide zero carbon or carbon and negative power and energy to our customers and our partners. We're embedded in the communities we operate. We're literally embedded on the generation system, but we're also embedded with our communities. So I think we've had a very unique perspective in terms of some of the changes we're seeing in the energy system now, how those are impacting communities at that distribution level, which is slightly below the transmission level that we tend to talk about when we talk about energy policy. So look forward to talking about that in further detail.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And I think we can already see there are so many perspectives and angles to this debate, both now and as we move through time as well, and we see that wider policy and wider infrastructure landscape evolving. So I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into some of those opening remarks by each of our speakers. And Noel, I'd like to come to you first, and it really strikes me from a combined authority perspective, how do you begin to approach strategic energy planning, when we're talking about power, heat, transport, infrastructure, all for a broader region? How do you go about that, and where do you see industry sitting within that mix?
So it's a really good question. So kind of the role that we play as an organisation is very much that kind of strategic one within a region. So we work with our local authorities to kind of understand quite a complex series of challenges and aspirations. So we look at this through quite a few lenses. So the first would be around what are our growth aspirations as a region? Where is it that we want to position our industry? Where are our homes going to be? Where is business? And how are we going to kind of look at decarbonising all of that? The second lens we kind of look at this through is very much around, what are our future energy demands within the region? So how much are we going to need? When is that going to be predicted to come on stream? And, what does that look like within the region? And then as well, we look through the lens of, we've got a net zero target within West Yorkshire, net zero by 2038. So it's all about us trying to understand, predict and plan for all those different kind of things. So we kind of look at this in terms of, well, what's the evidence? So we very much look at this from an evidence-based perspective. So what is the scale of the challenge that we need to get to where we need to be, whether that is in terms of emissions, whether that's in terms of the number of houses, whether that's the kind of industrial kind of facilities that we know might come on stream. So it's very much about doing that. And we did some really detailed information, particularly around our net zero target, to say, to get to 2038, what does this mean? What is the scale of the challenge, the scale of the interventions that are needed? So to give you some examples, there's things like we think we'll need around 800,000 heat pumps needed to be deployed in the region to our homes. We only have just over a million homes, so there's a really big challenge, but we've developed that understanding to start with about what it is that we need to get towards. That gives us part of the jigsaw, but what it doesn't do is give us that spatial representation about, well, where are those measures going to be deployed across the region? So we've got something I called our local area energy plans, which we've been developing over the last 18 months. We'll start to play out those kind of interventions on a spatial scale. So you'll start to see where are the pockets, where are the opportunities when it comes to those different energy technologies. And industry is a really good example of where we've done that. So what you'll see when we publish our local area energy plans is, from an industry perspective, you'll start to see where there are obvious clusters of businesses, industry, that could come together and work together to really decarbonise. And then the kind of third thing we're kind of doing around spatial kind of strategic energy planning is really around how does that interface with everything else, in terms of infrastructure. Energy is just one part of that jigsaw. We also have water in there. We also have, obviously, as I've talked about, our growth aspirations. So what does that look like when it all comes together? And how do we look at that in a very kind of overarching strategic way and start planning for things happening so that we achieve that kind of ambition that's set out in the work that we kind of do. And then I guess we also know in terms of kind of strategic energy planning, where our businesses are. We have good relationships with our businesses as well. So it's taking this evidence to those businesses as well and trying to kind of work with them to achieve kind of decarbonisation aspirations.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think certainly a few themes we'll come back to when we explore sort of co-benefits and wider considerations as well, which would be really great to touch on in more detail. Jeanette, coming to you, and from your perspective, you're looking at a range of technologies that play a role in decarbonisation, especially coming to areas such as bioenergy, for example. How do you see that these technologies could interact and actually play kind of a complementary role in achieving this wider system decarbonisation?
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, UKCEH work across a whole range of renewable energy technologies, but also greenhouse gas removal technologies, ways to actually take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And we also look at the impacts of energy efficiency. And all of these different strands of activity are needed because the situation with climate change is really urgent. You know, we need to throw the kitchen sink at it, basically. We need to use everything that's in our toolbox to try and mitigate this threat. And so it's a bit like at home, you know, as individuals, consumers, we're told to reduce, reuse, recycle. And for businesses, it's a similar approach, really. So energy efficiency, you know, is great for business and great for the environment. You know, making processes more efficient so that you're using less energy reduces your costs and it reduces the emissions. And so that's the low-hanging fruit. That's the no-brainer to me. Then you've got reuse. You've got to make sure that you're not having wasteful processes, waste energy, waste heat particularly, and whether that's low-carbon heat networks or other technologies to introduce so that you are making the most of the resources that you are using. And then we get to energy switching and fuel switching, and then there is a whole range of renewables available to you. And we've done lots of work in CEH looking at the different ways that they're integrated in the environment, how to do that in a sustainable way without negatively impacting the resources that those technologies depend on. You know, so siting of solar farms, for example, how do offshore wind farms impact on biodiversity? And these are all questions where we're identifying issues, but we're also coming up with solutions. So not saying you can't put that there because X is going to suffer. It's how do we site these things sensitively so that we can progress, develop, deploy infrastructure, but in a way that doesn't impact the environment badly. And then there's the hard to decarbonise sectors. And so here we need to be looking at more innovative technologies. So things like solar, we know how to do that. We know how to do a biomass power station. You know, there's lots of technologies that we can deploy right now. But things like hydrogen and carbon capture are getting nearer and nearer to a scale where we can really deploy them economically and across a whole range of industries. And for harder to decarbonise sectors like concrete, steel, you know, big energy demand, big energy users. There's lots of work going on there. And so I guess, you know, it's obvious, but there isn't a one size fits all. You know, you've got to look at your industry, the scale that you need, but there's lots of advantages in the environment for doing this well. And there's lots of advantages for local communities and regions as well for doing this well and doing it in a place-based, integrated way. So, yeah, the kind of systems thinking that Noel's doing, it can be really supported with this kind of environmental evidence.
Excellent, thank you. And I think that really sort of sheds light on the range and breadth of those decarbonised options and routes available. And actually, Carl, that's a point I'd like to pick up with you a bit further. So I think when looking at specific sectors, the waste sector is a real example of one of those that does have kind of a series of decarbonisation opportunities available to it. For your sector, would you be able to go into a bit more detail on what these opportunities look like and sort of specifically within the north, what does that look like for the region as well?
Sure. So for us, we think there's a short, medium, long-term trajectory. So short-term is do the day job, stop waste going to landfill. As people probably know, biodegradable waste going to landfill creates methane. Methane is far more damaging to the climate than CO2, so we should stop doing that. But then we think about in the short to medium term, what is it that we can be doing to help other people in our communities use our power, our energy to help them decarbonize? So a good example of that is, I mentioned we have just opened a new facility down the road in Skelton Grange. about a month ago, we announced we've just launched a partnership with SSE, whereby the waste heat that we're currently producing at our facility, which isn't being used for a useful purpose, will now be used by SSE to form the anchor load for a heat network in the region. Initially, Yorkshire Water will be the first anchor client for that network, but the hope is that it will grow and feed more industrial users in Leeds in the medium to long term. So looking across our fleet for opportunities like that. And then in the long term, the solution for the waste sector has to be carbon capture and storage. Using waste to create energy creates carbon. There's no getting away from that reality. So the question then becomes, what can we do to make the commercial story for CCS work? A number of waste projects have been involved in the early bidding rounds that the government has been running for carbon capture and storage in the UK. There's a number of reasons why energy from waste plant makes a lot of sense as a core emitter feeding a CO2 network. But the opportunity, if we start to roll CCS across the UK's 60 or so energy from waste facilities, so there are a lot of these facilities across the country, as we start to put CCS on them, not only are we stopping fossil CO2, primarily from burning plastics entering the atmosphere, but we're also capturing the biodegradable CO2 and putting it in the ground, which is a carbon removal. So we can see a double benefit of rolling CCS out across our plants. But because some plants will not be able to access pipeline infrastructure and have to think about, can we use non-pipeline infrastructure instead? It's going to be a kind of gradual transition for the sector, it's safe to say. But I think if we can articulate that as a vision, at least that gives us a credible story that we can start to bring to events like this and for people to understand what our strategy is.
Excellent, thank you very much. And I think, across all of these interventions, it's very clear of the opportunity that this really poses in terms of decarbonisation. But I think a point that you've brought up at the end that would be good to explore a bit more is when we're looking at the future of industry, we're talking about the decarb opportunity, but there are a range of co-benefits. This cross-cuts multiple areas of UK PLC, of the economy, and I think it's really interesting to sort of piece together those co-benefits as well. So this is an area that I'd actually like to discuss with each of you from your perspectives, but Carl, maybe we can just stick with you for now and expand on that latter point that you raised around, how does that investment in industrial decarb really produce those co-benefits for wider areas of the economy and in the regions in the north especially?
Well, I think, co-benefit number one, given the events we've been seeing in recent days, is that we create homegrown energy. People tend not to look at their bin and think this is a source of energy, but that is absolutely what it is. Obviously, homegrown domestic sourced energy has risen up the agenda over the past 3-4 years as a result of external factors. I think that's going to obviously continue this year, it feels like. So we think co-benefit number one is energy security. The other benefit we see as an existing piece of infrastructure that generates energy is that we've already got grid connections. Therefore, we can help partner with other sectors of the economy, which are priority industrial strategy growth sectors, to potentially help them accelerate their plans. One opportunity we're identifying, like many others, is data centers. So we're actively discussing with a number of data centers that are looking to co-locate near our facilities. Could we find a way for them to speed up their deployment timelines by accessing our energy via private wire agreement, where we would bring the energy direct to them via cable as opposed to going through the network? But also, could they use some of our infrastructure to provide the resilience they need as well? So again, instead of having, for example, a diesel generator on their site, could they use our grid connection as a source of resiliency as well? So we think, given we're existing infrastructure with established grid connections, that's one of our superpowers, as our CEO likes to say, to enable things to move forward quicker.
Excellent, thank you. And that's when you look at this as just for one sector, I think that range becomes very clear and that cross-cutting implication. Jeanette, I'd like to come to you next and touch on maybe some of those wider benefits from the UK CEH perspective.
Yeah, sure. I guess there's a couple of things that come to mind. And when you talk about homegrown energy, it means something quite different to me, because I'm thinking about biomass, and literally homegrown biomass is something that we don't do a whole lot of in this country. So we import a lot of biomass feedstocks, wood chips, for energy, for large-scale power use. We do use some crop residues, forest residues, straw that is in this country, but we do have capacity to produce a lot more, both from forestry, short rotation forestry, and from biomass crops that can be grown onto agricultural land. And so I'm thinking much more literally about homegrown, because there is a real potential to use land to generate energy. And that has a regional benefit because it keeps the value in the region. It allows farmers to diversify when they're struggling to make farm incomes. These are crops that can be grown on poor quality land. So it is much more about how do you support that kind of diversification of agriculture that feeds into our energy supply. The other area that I think about co-benefits is really around air quality. There's really good evidence, including from UK CEH Science, that shifting from fossil to electric vehicles has had massive benefits for excuse me, for air quality, and those air quality benefits are realised in human health benefits. So the ULEZ in London, unpopular in some circles, but it's created around £37 million of savings in public health costs, because people that live in areas with high traffic and high pollution tend to have lower health. They're more likely to have asthma and those kind of conditions. And so actually, if you can decarbonise, but you're also taking pollution out of the atmosphere, helping people's health, but also helping business, because healthy people work more, they take less sick leave. And so those kind of co-benefits can compound through the system. If you can improve the environment as part of this transition, there's benefits all around. So yeah, the two examples from me.
Excellent, thank you so much, and very helpful to have those alternative perspectives as well. And Noel, last but not least, I'd like to come to you to touch on the same point, and especially kind of around that local growth point as well, which I feel will be quite relevant to the combined authority.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that first point that kind of Cal made in terms of that energy security. That's really, really important to kind of us as a region to kind of give that certainty, give that kind of security to people and to businesses across the region, to make sure that they aren't going to be hit by shocks. We've heard quite a lot about that in the kind of past 5 years or so, where our businesses are really, an industry particularly, is kind of crying out in terms of trying to have a bit more certainty, a bit more security around those energy costs, which is really, really valuable to us. I think competitiveness as well is a really big point here as well. Fair enough, it isn't industry, but from our understanding from the SME communities, what we're seeing is where organisations are investing in decarbonisation, we're seeing 52% of those SMEs saying to us, that's actually attracted new customers to our business because of what we're doing there. Really big point to make on that one. And then again, it's also from our SMEs, but also 67% of those are kind of saying, are reporting lower operational costs because of those measures. Again, really, really valuable for our industries to kind of reflect on that and have that consideration. Job creation is a really big one as well for us within the region. And if I can use an example from the work that's been done in Bradford, so the Bradford Manufacturing Futures work there, which was kind of an approach to collecting lots of kind of industrial organisations together and understanding how they can decarbonise as a bigger collective. So how do you cluster? How do you take advantage of that multiple number of businesses coming together to understand how they can decarbonise as a collective? So for Bradford, we're talking about 1,200 manufacturing businesses in Bradford, 13% of jobs. It's a significant contribution to the £12 billion of GDP that's created in Bradford. The decarbonisation work that's been thought about and considered through the kind of Bradford Manufacturing Futures work is suggesting that could support over 1,000 jobs. Now, that's not to be sniffed at, as all you can imagine, and it'll kind of suggest that there's an investment of around half 500 million to 1.2 billion that would be needed to do that, but that gives generation in terms of renewables, but also low carbon technology. So there's some really bigger system benefits, and certainly something we're pushing into as a combined authority more is what is the core benefit of all of this activity? How do we make it clear to people? If you're not turned on by things like net zero, don't be turned off by the fact that you can have bill savings, you can have cost reductions, you can be more competitive. You know, it does really generate some significant additional benefits.
Brilliant, thank you, Noel. And I think some really key themes coming out here. I think energy security, obviously, is something that we can't watch the news and not hear about at the moment. I think from the panel's perspective, both in terms of domestic molecules, but also in terms of homegrown feedstock as well. So a really interesting theme. Essential services such as waste management, air quality, jobs and competitiveness to enable regional growth. Clearly there's a range here of those co-benefits to the wider UK PLC of decarbonising our industry. And I do always like to start with the glass half full, which I think is really good to get into the details on each of those. So thank you for those perspectives. I think it's also good to be realistic that this is a complicated area. There are wider considerations and trade-offs, and in some cases, some barriers as well, which means that we can't move as fast as we would like to on some of these areas. Maybe we can now start to touch on some of those to kind of add dimension to this debate. So, Jeanette, maybe I could start with you from a more environmental perspective. What really are those barriers that we see to scaling up some of these technologies that, you know, otherwise we could, or otherwise without those barriers, we could start to deliver that deeper decarbonisation?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, there are barriers. I'm not keen on that word barriers because it sounds like they're not insurmountable. You know, you can't get past them, and you really can. You know, they're not insurmountable. And so it's just about making evidence-based decisions as we develop this transition. The main issue is really that for renewable energy, success with renewable energy does depend on or impact our natural resources, and so it's circular. So if we're going to use our land, air, water for renewables, we need to make sure that that's a sustainable process. And as I said, that we're not mitigating climate change, that we're not helping to tackle climate change, but on the other side, creating more biodiversity loss or decreasing our water quality, decreasing our air quality. So it's really about having balanced decision making that takes into account all of these different areas. And that's something in CEH that we try and take a really positive view around. So looking for solutions. So some of our scientists in Scotland are working with offshore wind farms to really understand the potential impacts of offshore wind on biodiversity, on bird populations, but then looking at what compensation measures, what mitigations can we put in place, how can we do those environmental impact assessments, those siting decisions in a way that minimises the harm. And so you get renewable energy generation, but without that biodiversity loss risk. And that's where the risks lie, is just not doing this properly, not doing it carefully. And that does sometimes take time, or it just requires that extra step to really look into that careful evidence around what might the risks be, what might the impacts be, so that you can take all of those different areas into account. But there are solutions out there, and companies are really great at taking this on board. Government are trying to provide the right frameworks around this, and I know that they're not always successful, but you know, together I do believe that we can create this renewable energy transition to deliver. So that's my view.
Excellent, thank you, and noted. And I think challenges rather than barriers is a good term to be using. You mentioned a point around, you know, making sure that we are doing this properly, safely. You know, we're assessing all of those interactions. And I think when we look at the decarbonisation scene within the UK, you know, there is a robust network for permitting, for regulation, for example. But in some cases, a lot of these are new solutions, and it takes time to get used to this permitting regime. Carl, if I could come to you on this point and kind of the time associated with some of that. I mean, from your perspective, do you think there are any opportunities for kind of safely cutting that red tape when it comes to some of these considerations and associated time constraints?
Yeah, well, I guess first thing is regulation can be positive. For example, the waste sector currently isn't in the emissions trading scheme in the UK, so up until this point, we've never had to pay a carbon tax for some of the fossil carbon I mentioned earlier. that is changing from 2028. And from our perspective, that's a very welcome change because it forces that decarbonisation agenda to come sooner. So regulation can be an enabler, but equally, as you say, there are some barriers or hurdles. As a business which has 6 facilities across 2 environmental regulators in the UK and multiple DNOs, we have seen it is challenging, primarily for the reason you said, Beth, which is people are being asked to do things differently than they have before, and it still feels like we're in that transition period where whether you're an environmental regulator, a local authority, a combined authority, a distribution network operator, transmission network operator, everyone's been tasked with these new responsibilities and everyone's trying to figure out how do we all work together to deliver the mission. So I think it's less about do we cut back on regulation. I think it's more about making sure that the organizations that are tasked with working with industry to deliver these things have the resources they need. Because I think we've jumped to the step of allocating responsibility and then resourcing is kind of still running to catch up. So I think it's more important that we make the system work rather than trying to find ways to take requirements out of the system, is my view.
Absolutely. Really, really useful perspective. Thank you. And I think before we move on to the final points, Noel, it'd be good to come to you actually on a point that we've not touched on quite as much through those interventions, which is naturally when it comes to decarbonisation as well, there is the challenge of the associated cost and how do we make sure that this is a commercial solution as well as a low carbon solution. Do you see much of a role from bodies such as the National Wealth Fund, so public finance, in really playing a role to drive decarbonisation in the wider region?
I think we're going to have to see some kind of intervention from the public side of things because a lot of what we do within combined authority is kind of thinking about pipelines and thinking about, well, how do you get to the end goal that we need to do that? And what we hear on a fairly regular basis from the private sector particularly is that they feel early stage side of stuff, kind of project development activities, is really risky. So there's really a role I see for the public kind of finance kind of getting into that space in terms of helping to do the de-risking of kind of projects. So, you know, early stage kind of project development activity, helping to kind of build the business case. And I think a really good example of that within West Yorkshire is the work, and I mentioned it earlier, of Bradford Manufacturing Futures. So there was funding from government through I think it was the local industrial decarbonisation programme, which gave some money to employ some consultants in Bradford to try and bring all those industries together to understand what it was that they could do to decarbonise. And as a result of that, they've got some idea about what is it that we need to do to decarbonise that sector in Bradford, or the clusters that have been identified in Bradford, and what needs to happen next. There's still going to be a role, I think, for some public finance in that piece to try and get it to the point where you can actually go to private investors to seek investment. But I definitely see that there's a role for kind of National Wealth Fund, GBE in that space, particularly where it ticks the boxes that they need to tick when it comes to it being things like Clean Power 2030, those types of things. So I think it's really about public finance trying to give that confidence, I suppose, to the private sector that there are some really good projects out there that are worth their investment in, worth collaborating with, and the risk is not as high as it maybe could be. But I think that's a really big role for the kind of the public kind of purse, public sector side of things on that. We can play softer roles as well, though, outside of the kind of financing piece as well, and that's kind of looking at how do we help with planning, perhaps, and to allow things to happen. And that could be a form of de-risking as well, rather than the kind of financing side of things. But also, you know, we have lines into central government that maybe private sector don't, or industry doesn't have. Actually, can we use those powers to really push into central government to understand what it is that industry needs to do to help them on this decarbonisation journey? You know, a really good one would be, I suppose, looking at the cost of electricity. How do we try and have conversations with government about how high electricity costs are? and how do we work with them to try and lower them, because ultimately that might be what prevents some of the businesses, the industry within our region from offshoring, going somewhere else, which is not what we want.
Excellent, thank you. And I think sort of to complete those interventions from your perspective, Noel, I think that kind of sheds light on the overall theme of today's conversation, which is, yes, there are challenges. We are starting on a journey which has its complexities, but overwhelmingly I am getting sort of a sense of these are things that can be overcome. There's a lot of co-benefits, there's a lot of interactions that the industry has started to think about very early into this process, and meaning that these are seen more as opportunities as we go through that decarbonisation journey. So that's something for the final question that I wanted to pose to each of you to touch on a bit more. And, you know, we've spent a lot of time today going through some of those opportunities. A lot of us in the room, this will be our bread and butter. This is the kind of thing that we look at within our day roles. But in terms of communicating those wider benefits beyond decarbonisation to communities, to the general public, to really bring the public on that journey that this is, yes, about meeting climate targets, but also, you know, huge benefits to the local communities, to regional growth. How do we go about taking them on that journey with us? Noel, maybe I can start with you and then work back along the panel for that final point.
Yes, certainly. I think it's a really pertinent question for where we are as an organisation at the moment, in terms of there are local elections coming up in West Yorkshire at the moment. Net zero is very politicised at the moment. So for us, it's about pushing into those core benefits that we talked about. So really making sure that people are aware of, actually, if you don't believe in climate change, you aren't on the net zero kind of journey, there are other benefits of doing this kind of work. So really pushing into, well, what's the job creation potential of what you're doing? You know, what's the bill savings perhaps, or what's the opportunity to retain jobs? So it's not just job creation, it's about, you know, retaining jobs in a region as well, and giving people that confidence that actually this is really an area in which, you know, there are benefits that you can get on board with. It's not just about climate change, it's not just about net zero, so it's about us communicating that, and we're doing that in terms of how we communicate with our residents, with our businesses, with our industry, very much kind of saying, well, if you don't do it for climate reasons, there's a whole host of core benefits that you would want to. You can't deny those benefits, surely.
Great, thank you. And Jeanette?
Yeah, I mean, I think a similar theme, really, that when the idea of net zero is under pressure, I think net zero is quite intangible to people, and so we have to connect the transition to things that people do value locally, whether that's clean air, clean water, good health, better jobs, and show how the transition can help to deliver those things. And I think as a scientist, I see my role really in helping to give people trust and faith in the decision making that's going on. So showing that in the decisions, you're using industry and governments are using good, robust evidence around environmental impacts, costs and benefits, so that they can trust that nature and their environment are being taken into account when decisions around infrastructure, deployment, development are being considered. So yeah, I think it's a balance of just linking it, as Noel said, linking it to things that people really care about. And, you know, I'm sure a few of you will have seen the Dirty Business kind of documentary, and you see the way that galvanise public opinion around water quality, rivers. You know, people really care about their environment. And so it's just finding a way that's meaningful to people to communicate.
Thank you. And Carl?
I agree with all that. I think we have to recognise we're still in a cost of living crisis for many people. And I think we're going to be approaching a employment crisis, a sort of youth employment crisis in the future as we think about the secondary impacts of AI. So we need to frame everything around that. Just maybe as an interesting data point into that, obviously we had the by-election last week, which produced a new Green MP. I was looking at some of the analysis of the polling from that. The typical Green, and we saw a new poll yesterday, a day before, putting the Green Party, you know, up to 15-20%, something like that, in terms of national support. When you drill down into the typical Green voter now versus 5 years ago, there was a question around why would you support an environmental project, and cost of living and affordability actually trumped the environmental benefits of that. So that just shows that even for the kind of Green Party or for the Green voter, as we would typically associate, even that calculus has moved on. What they resonate and respond to is changing. So I think we need to respond to that as a sector, otherwise we're not going to get cut through.
No, absolutely. And I think some really critical points to end on. We can talk about the commerciality, we can talk about the technical challenges, the interplay, but ultimately we're also operating in a political environment where making sure that the public are on board with that is absolutely critical to our cause, and making sure that this can yield the impact that it really has the potential to. I've spent the last 45 minutes or so quizzing the panel, and I think this has really just stressed how broad this topic is, and how many considerations need to go into the deployment of these novel but also really robust decarbonisation technologies. We do have about 15 minutes left, so I'm very keen to pass over to the audience and see if anybody's got any questions for any of our panellists on the topics covered today. We've got one in the front and then one on the second row as well. Thank you.
Hi. Question for Carl, really. Just wondered if you could clarify your description of the waste to energy with CCS as carbon negative. Does that depend entirely on avoided emissions from landfill or elsewhere, or is there some removals element as it might be with biomass?
There is, and that's a good point. So, sorry, did you want to take the second question before I jumped in, Beth?
Yes, good point. If we could take the second one, and then we can answer both of them. Thank you.
Question primarily for Jeanette. You talk about biomass and wood. Most of it is coming from the USA, North America. So we've got almost like a monopoly position. So energy security is a bit of a risk at the moment. Also, some people argue that trees take quite a long time to grow back, longer than we've got left to meet net zero with the UK's equitably shared proportion of the global carbon emissions, carbon budget, sorry. And if the USA started to charge us compensation for them having the emissions and us not, and subsidies, etc., coming to the big power stations, that also perhaps makes us a bit vulnerable. And actually, a little one for Carl. Biogenic waste, much of it is, well, some of it is packaging, which comes from wood, which may not come from the UK. Therefore, the same thing applies. We ignore the carbon emissions from that. As and when we do, and I think that's likely to be fairly soon, then the amount of biogenic waste that's going to be going, that'll be untaxed, will drop down quite a bit. Anyway, thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much for both of those questions. Carl, should we come to you first, and then we can move on to Jeanette afterwards?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So when you look nationally, around, on average, 50% of the waste that we produce as a society is fossil-based. And again, that's typically plastic, virgin plastic that we don't recycle, or plastic that we can't recycle because the technology doesn't exist or the infrastructure doesn't exist. And 50% is biodegradable waste, so food waste, packaging waste, etc., etc. The government, so first of all, is we should absolutely try and reduce as much waste as we produce. The government is introducing a series of new policies, deposit return schemes, extended packaging producer responsibility to try and reduce the amount of waste that we produce. So that is absolutely priority number one. But when you look at the UK government's targets, even when we get to 2042, we'll still have around 50% of the waste we produce now, which is still 17, 18 million tons of waste. And a ton of waste is roughly a ton of CO2. So we'll have 18 million tons of carbon in the 2040s that we need to deal with as a society. So that's the challenge. If we put CCS on those facilities, as you said, we'll capture, and you capture 90 to 95% of the emissions, say. We'll capture most of the fossil fuel emissions. We'll also capture the biodegradable emissions. You'll have a small amount of residual emissions, but the amount of biogenic, biodegradable CO2 that you capture should be enough not only to cover off those residual emissions, but actually to go carbon negative. And I think there's a very deep academic critical mass of analysis showing that is borne out in terms of the climate science. Your point separately, sir, about the life cycle emissions of biogenic CO2, I think that's something that the UK government is also is looking at, because it also wants to make sure that if people are doing carbon capture and making these claims about carbon negative, that those are actually substantiated by a full chain life cycle analysis. So I think the stated ambition from the UK government is in the next 12 to 18 months to have what it calls a greenhouse gas removal standard, which basically says if you can create a carbon credit within this defined methodology, it's got an implicit or an explicit stamp of approval from the UK government. So I think that will be a good forcing mechanism to make sure that everyone's working to the right same methodology when they make their calculations, but also hopefully gives people some confidence that when people are making these claims about being carbon negative, that it's actually substantiated and endorsed by the UK government.
Excellent. Thank you, Carl. And Jeanette, could I come on to you for that question as well?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so in terms of imported forest residues for biomass, we do import a significant quantity of wood pellets from the US and from other countries which are used for biomass in this country currently. They are predominantly made from forest residues, not virgin timber. They are. And so the forest harvesting and the timber is going to other products, to construction and other high-value wood products. And there's considerable amount that is taken as forest residues, which is the waste that you get from the sawmills and other products like that. So it's not just as simple as plant a tree, chop it down, bring it to a biomass, but there are obviously sustainability concerns. And as they said, the government are developing a biomass sustainability framework that is looking to be much more rigorous around those requirements for sustainability for biomass. One of the alternatives, if we're worrying about energy security in terms of importing from overseas, is more domestic biomass production from this country, and that's something that I've done quite a bit of research on. And whilst you're right to say that mature trees do take a long time to store carbon and deliver those carbon savings, we can grow forestry in different ways. So we can do short rotation forestry, which is more densely planted. You harvest a lot younger, and it generates more biomass in terms of mass. There's also short rotation coppice, which are woody crops. And so there are ways of planting now to deliver biomass over 3 to 10 to 15-year timescales that are well within the targets for net zero. And so I think it's just about thinking and looking really carefully at those time horizons to say, why do we want tree planting in this country? Why do we want biomass? And can we align those two things? Because there's different needs in terms of tree planting for nature, for conservation, and for potentially for biomass, timber and other wood products. So yeah, it's a really complicated debate, but I would definitely support trying to produce more domestically to reduce those concerns about energy security.
Thank you very much, both. And I think it was just last week the government consultation on sustainable biomass closed, I think 128 questions or something like that.
Yes, it was a bit overwhelming. Yeah, we didn't answer all 128. Yeah.
And likewise with the standards that you're mentioning, Carl, kind of just showing the level of detail, I suppose, that's going into this early on to set out that process and build that trust so that it can be adhered to and consistent as it's rolled out in the future. So really good questions and really good answers. Thank you very much. Has anybody else got any questions at all? I think we've got 5 or 10 minutes left if we do. Yes, lady in the front row, thank you.
So given how far we've already come, because I think sometimes we get so focused on how far we've got to go, we forget actually we've come a really long way already. I wonder what makes you excited for the future in terms of where you see us going next, rather than be a bit more optimistic rather than pessimistic.
Thank you. Could I suggest actually that we come to each of the panel for an answer to that question? I think maybe Noel, we could come to you first and work along.
Really good question. I guess what am I excited for the future? I think just the transition, I think, is really exciting. If we kind of move past, we get fixated on net zero and all the rest of it. I think it's what that actually brings about that's quite exciting. The change to cleaner technologies, the differences in where we heat our homes, we power our businesses. That transition in itself, I think, is really, really exciting, and having the ability to be at the forefront of that and being able to influence and steer and shape how that pans out within a region like West Yorkshire, that from an organisational perspective and a personal perspective, that's what gets me up on a morning, is that ability to influence and change and see how we can benefit other people's lives as well through these technological changes.
Jeanette.
Yeah, I mean, I think nice question. Thank you. We have come such a long way. I've been an environmental scientist for 30 years, and even 5 or 10 years ago, talking to that taxi driver or the bus driver about climate change, you'd get fairly short shrift. People didn't believe it, didn't think it was real, thought it was some figment of scientists' imaginations. And so I think just people's awareness and understanding and acceptance that, the vast majority of scientists across the world say there is strong evidence that we're causing climate change, that enables action. And I think people's appreciation of the environment and understanding of the impacts of human beings on the environment has really transformed with kind of the information that's available to us all really now to understand our impact. So I think that can only be positive. If people have got more information, they can choose what political party they support, they can choose what they do in their lives. And so I think that's a really positive way to end.
Great, thank you. And Carl?
I think one is the success we've had in the past 20, 30 years across lots of different parts of the economy. I think the fundamentals of the UK are still pretty good. I think if you just read the media and doom scrolled on your phone, you would think that net zero agenda's dead. The UK is not an investable place to be from a development perspective. But actually, if you look around any part of the economy, there's stuff happening on clean tech and the clean economy. So there's actually quite a lot happening, which is very positive. And I think the fundamentals are still quite good. We have an infrastructure owner investor that have the opportunity to invest anywhere in the world, and they want to invest in projects that we originate as a business in the UK because it's still a very attractive place to invest. It doesn't feel like that always, but I think that is still the reality because the grass isn't always greener elsewhere, as they would attest to. So I think the fundamentals being quite strong and stuff is still happening. Stuff is happening, I think, is kind of the key message.
Brilliant, thank you. Really nice question and great answers as well. Can I just check? I think we've got about 5 minutes left, so we do have time for another question or two if there are any in the room. Yes, gentlemen, just over here. Thank you.
So, question to Carl, really. Have you considered using algal-based carbon capture? Because that way you're not using any harsh chemicals and you're actually yielding a valuable biomass.
So I think I guess the starting point for us has been from an engineering perspective, we are a point source emitter of CO2. The first phase of our CCS strategy has been applying for the government funding rounds that have been made available to us, partly because that gives you grant support, but also it gives you the ability to connect to the first 2 clusters that are being developed in Merseyside and Teesside. If you don't have that support, it's very hard for you to connect. Those funding rounds require that you have a TRL 7 or above technology underpinning you. So I think we have looked at novel things. We've had a couple of CCS pilot plants at our facilities, one of which is a MOF technology. So I think our current position is for us to scale CCS, we probably need some technology innovation to enable costs to come down and for it to be more attractive to developers, whether you're a point source emitter of CO2 or a biogenic source of CO2. So we support the principle. I guess we've been pushed into that what's on the shelf today approach because that's where the government is pushing us to try and de-risk it from a UK taxpayer perspective, which again, completely get and understand. So that's where the point of focus for us has been today, but very, very happy to have a conversation afterwards about alternative solutions if people want to do that.
Brilliant. Thank you for the question and thank you, Carl, as well. I think from the looks of it, that concludes the Q&A. So I think without further ado, I'd just like to thank all of the panelists for their insights. I think what's really come through more than anything is that the UK is in a real position of opportunity for decarbonising its economy, both in terms of meeting climate targets, but also really testing some of this innovation, this technology, creating and transitioning that market and leading to that sustainable future to promote growth across regions such as the North. I also think some great questions as well, really delving into some of these details, and just illustrates how much thinking is happening on the ground now to make sure that these solutions are developed in a robust and a cross-cutting way. So I will conclude there. Thank you for the questions. Thank you very much for the interventions, and happy to catch up with anyone after if you'd like to discuss further. Thank you.